Now, listening to Dr. Gary Habermas, I wonder how many of you know what he's talking about when he mentioned James, the brother of our Lord Jesus, and the Apostle Paul. Well, before we go on, I asked him to talk about why these two men provide such important proof for the resurrection of Jesus. Listen.
Well, one rule of historiography is the principle of embarrassment. When you're saying something important and you admit there's a weakness over here, it probably really reflects something that occurred in time and space. In the Gospel of John, chapter 7, we learned that James was a skeptic. And in the Synoptics, when Jesus comes home, his brothers and sisters are not part of that believing crew. And I think to myself, you know, an insider skeptic presents a special dimension. Here's somebody who's been raised, and was he ever told, Jesus did a better job than this? Or you don't have to be told, you can just see it. And how many times do you, hard for me to take this. He's always an angel, you know, and he doesn't believe. Now, we turn a few pages in the New Testament, and where's James? He's the pastor of the largest church in the ancient world. And in Acts 15, the so-called Jerusalem Council, Peter's here, Paul's here. Who hands down the final word? One of those guys, right? No, James stands up and gives the deciding opinion. When you're in when you're in his domain, when you're in Jerusalem, you listen to what he's got to say. He's the pastor. Now, how do you go from skeptic to biggest pastor in the ancient world? Paul supplies that answer in 1 Corinthians 15:7. He says, and then he appeared to James also. Now, Reginald Fuller says, even if Paul doesn't have this bridge from skeptic to pastor, I still have to assume there was one. Why? Fuller says, without that appearance, I can't assume, one, that James was converted. I have no reason for it. And number two, his subsequent elevation to this important post as pastor from this insider over here. And the conclusion is, we have a strong evidence here for the resurrection. What led to James's conversion and subsequent promotion in the early church?
Many people look at the Apostle Paul, and when they try to figure out why he became a Christian, they stumble. They give a lot of naturalistic explanations, but what Paul himself said makes sense. Talk about that.
Well, we have Paul's testimony here, and Paul is taken seriously because today, a little saying I use oftentimes in the classroom, Paul is in, the Gospels are out. Now, I don't think we don't need to go along with that. We can work on the Gospels, but we do have Paul. And from Paul's 13 epistles that bear his name, critics will unanimously give you somewhere between 5 and 8 of those epistles. And Paul himself says that, for example, the book of Philippians, he says he was persecuting the church. He was a Hebrew of the Hebrews, a Pharisee, no friend of Christianity. He thought he was doing God a favor to take men, women, and children captive. And he was participating in their death sometimes, as in holding the clothing of those who were stoning Stephen in the book of Acts. So Paul is definitely a skeptic. You might say he had a PhD under Gamaliel in Hebrew studies. And this is a cult, and he's been given the mantle. He's the man, he's the choice to go after these Christians. And he meets the risen Jesus. Jesus says, I want you, you're my man. And Paul sees the resurrected Jesus, and now he becomes perhaps the greatest missionary, theologian, mind in the early church. Now we have Paul's own testimony here for what happened. Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15:8, at the end of that creed, after summarizing the creed, he says, last of all, he appeared to me as one born out of due time. A few chapters earlier, same book, 1 Corinthians 9:1, he says, am I not an apostle? Have I not seen the Lord? And all through Paul's writings, the resurrection is the key. So you get the resurrection is the key for what I'm doing. He appeared to me in particular. And you know, Paul never lost the thankfulness to God for the grace he extended to him. Thank you for saving me out of my previous studies and bringing me to yourself. But again, the key, if it wasn't for that resurrection appearance of Jesus, Paul would not be in the camp and he would not be a witness, but he is.